We are standing at the edge of a silent revolution not marked by banners or bullets, but by transactions, algorithms, and the quiet erosion of autonomy. You are told your money is yours, that your cash, your digital wallet, your spending power represents freedom. But beneath this comforting fiction lies a system meticulously designed not to liberate you, but to monitor, influence, and ultimately control you. The war over your financial sovereignty is not coming. It is already here. You are participating in it every time you tap your card, send a wire, or make a digital purchase. And what's most alarming, you haven't even noticed, because when power shifts quietly, it rarely asks permission. For much of modern history, financial instruments were perceived as passive tools, mechanisms for exchange, savings, investment, or risk management. Money, in all its forms, was seen as a servant to the economy, not its master. But that perception no longer holds. The evolving reality is that financial instruments, far from being neutral, are now deployed as instruments of influence manipulated by states, controlled by centralized powers, and embedded with implicit codes of obedience. The consequences of this shift are neither accidental nor trivial. They are systemic, global, and deeply political. To understand how money becomes a weapon, one must begin by observing the nature of its control. Currencies today are not only minted by governments, they are regulated through a complex, often opaque network of financial institutions, international agreements, and supranational bodies. These institutions increasingly behave not as custodians of economic stability, but as agents of strategic interest. The dollar, for instance, has ceased to be merely a store of value or a medium of exchange. It has become an instrument of compliance extended to allies, withdrawn from adversaries, and weaponized through sanctions and financial restrictions. This dynamic is not confined to geopolitics. At the individual level, the same infrastructure is being replicated. Consider the way payment processors, banks, and platforms are now empowered to freeze, delay, or reject transactions based on policy positions or perceived affiliations. This is not commerce, it is governance by proxy. The architecture of finance is being co-opted to enforce rules that were never publicly debated nor democratically approved. And the most concerning aspect is the subtlety with which this happens. No one is told explicitly that their freedom is curtailed. It is assumed, normalized, embedded in terms of service. The digitization of money has only accelerated this transformation. Physical cash, while imperfect, offered anonymity a space of unmonitored autonomy. But as economies transition toward cashless systems, that space is rapidly shrinking. Every swipe, every scan, every contactless transaction generates data, and that data becomes leverage. It is analyzed, profiled, sold, or weaponized depending on the prevailing winds of interest. You may think you are simply buying groceries or donating to a cause, but in doing so, you enter into a system where that act is recorded, interpreted, and possibly judged. One might argue that regulation is necessary to prevent illicit behavior. That is the typical justification offered for expanding financial surveillance. But this justification often ignores proportionality. It assumes that the risk posed by bad actors warrants a blanket policy of scrutiny. And while it is true that criminality must be addressed, the unintended consequence, or perhaps the intended one, is that entire populations become suspect by default. This inversion of the presumption of innocence within financial behavior is one of the most troubling developments of our time. Furthermore, as central banks explore the rollout of digital currencies, the implications become even more pronounced. A central bank digital currency is not merely a digitized dollar or euro. It is programmable money capable of being directed, expired, or conditioned. Imagine a currency that can only be spent on authorized goods, or a stipend that disappears if not used within a set time frame. These are not hypotheticals. They are features being tested quietly in closed pilot programs. Such a system does not merely replace existing money, it rewrites the social contract between citizen and state. The private sector, too, is complicit. Fintech firms, often hailed as disruptors, have increasingly aligned themselves with state agendas. Whether through compliance with regulatory pressure or active participation in surveillance capitalism, they have abandoned neutrality. Algorithms used to score credit, approve mortgages, or offer investment opportunities are rarely neutral. They reflect existing biases and can entrench inequality. Worse, they are inscrutable, making it nearly impossible for individuals to understand, challenge, or correct them. It is time to recognize that the rules of money are no longer purely economic. They are ideological. They define what is permitted, who is trusted, and which behaviors are rewarded or punished. And these rules are enforced not by armies or police, but by infrastructure silently, persistently, and with plausible deniability. Those who value freedom, whether political or economic, must begin to view finance through a new lens, not as a neutral zone, but as a contested space, not as a tool of prosperity, but increasingly as a framework of control. The question is not whether this transformation will happen. It already has. The question is whether we will remain passive participants or reclaim the autonomy that money, in its purest form, was meant to represent. The promise of the digital age was liberation. It offered the illusion of frictionless interaction, boundless information, and individual empowerment. But embedded within this transformation is a darker, more calculating architecture, one where the tools of convenience double as instruments of observation. Surveillance capitalism, once an emergent byproduct of innovation, has now evolved into the dominant economic logic of our time. And when fused with the apparatus of financial control, it gives rise to a system not merely of profit, but of behavioral governance. The transition from analog to digital finance did not happen in isolation. It unfolded in parallel with the rise of data monopolies and platform economies, the same entities that monitor our social lives, preferences, and movements now intersect with the infrastructure that handles our transactions. The result is a fusion of two domains, finance and surveillance, which together create a predictive model of human behavior more invasive and more precise than any state mechanism of the past. Every payment, every purchase, every minor subscription is logged and indexed. It is not simply a ledger of spending, it is a psychographic profile. What you buy, how often, at what time of day, and in which emotional state these are signals, and the system learns from them. It doesn't merely observe, it anticipates. And in anticipating, it begins to shape. Recommendations are not neutral suggestions. They are nudges calibrated, tested, and optimized to channel decisions in directions that benefit a closed ecosystem of stakeholders. This is where the illusion of financial autonomy begins to unravel. In theory, a consumer operates in a market of choices, but in practice, those choices are increasingly manipulated not overtly, but through architecture. Defaults are designed, interfaces are gamified, terms of service are unreadable by design, and while this behavioral manipulation may appear benign a nudge to spend more, save more, click more, it carries deeper implications when linked to the institutions of financial power. Because behind this system of subtle persuasion lies a network of control. Financial accounts can be frozen, access denied, permissions revoked often without due process, and increasingly by private actors. Algorithms decide creditworthiness. Automated systems flag transactions for scrutiny. Appeals are rare, and accountability is elusive. This is not just a market, it is a regime. One that operates silently, without the rituals of public law or democratic scrutiny, but with the power to disrupt lives, constrain freedoms, and enforce compliance. And all of this is justified in the language of safety. Fraud prevention, anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing, these are the pillars upon which financial surveillance expands. Yet, there is a silent conflation here. The individual becomes suspect by default. The burden of proof reverses. Innocence is no longer presumed, but must be algorithmically earned. This is not risk management. It is preemptive punishment. The state and the corporation, once seen as checks on each other's power, have found common cause in this system. Governments outsource enforcement to platforms. Platforms benefit from privileged access and legal cover. It is a symbiosis not of accountability, but of mutual advantage. And in this convergence, the citizen becomes not merely a consumer or taxpayer, but a subject in a datafied experiment where their economic actions feed a machine they neither see nor control. This system is self-reinforcing. As more data is collected, more predictions can be made. As predictions improve, control tightens, and each tightening is sold as efficiency, the holy grail of late-stage capitalism. But efficiency is not neutral. It is a value, and when it is prioritized over transparency, justice, or human dignity, it becomes a form of violence, subtle, systematic, and disguised as progress. There is, of course, resistance. Encryption, decentralization, anonymous currencies, these are attempts to reclaim agency, but they remain marginal, often criminalized or co-opted before they scale. The dominant system is not merely resilient, it is adaptive. It absorbs critique, rebrands itself, and continues forward. And the public, lulled by convenience, rarely pauses to ask what is being traded for that ease. At its core, surveillance capitalism linked with financial control represents a profound shift in the human condition. It is not just that we are being watched. It is that we are being shaped invisibly, incrementally, and irreversibly. Our desires are forecasted, our behaviors molded, and our economic freedoms circumscribed within a lattice of code and capital. The stakes are no longer theoretical. What is at risk is the concept of autonomy itself, the right to act, transact, and exist without permission from an unseen algorithmic tribunal. If financial life becomes a function of behavioral compliance, then freedom is no longer a right. It is a score, and scores, as history reminds us, can always be rewritten by those who hold the pen. There was a time when economic policy was seen as a tool to foster development, stability, and international cooperation. Sanctions were a last resort, digital currencies a technological curiosity. Today, both have been re-engineered not merely as tools of policy, but as instruments of coercion. We are witnessing the financialization of geopolitical conflict, where the flows of capital are guided not by market fundamentals or shared values, but by strategic imperatives, ideological alignments, and an increasing willingness to convert economic infrastructure into a battleground. Sanctions, in their original conception, were meant to be temporary measures, blunt instruments to compel negotiation or deter aggression. What they have become, however, is a permanent fixture of foreign policy, deployed unilaterally and often without consensus. Entire nations are now subjected to complex webs of restrictions that touch every aspect of economic life: trade, banking, access to capital markets, even participation in global payment systems. And the reach of these measures is no longer confined to those deemed adversaries by international law. It extends to private corporations, financial institutions, and individuals who merely interact with those targets. The implications of this shift are profound. By denying access to systems like SWIFT or freezing sovereign reserves held in foreign banks, states can paralyze the economic apparatus of entire governments. No missiles need be launched, no armies need to cross borders. The economy itself becomes the theater of conflict. What was once war by other means has become a new kind of warfare, sanitized, silent, but no less devastating. In this context, the emergence of digital currencies is not merely an innovation in payment technology. It is a geopolitical event. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs in particular, are being developed not simply to modernize monetary systems, but to insulate economies from foreign influence, to create alternatives to the dollar-dominated system, and to exert new forms of domestic and international control. The narrative of financial inclusion, often invoked to justify these developments, masks a deeper reality. Digital currencies, by design, can be programmable. They can enforce monetary policy not just at the macro level, but at the level of individual behavior. A state could, for example, issue stimulus funds that expire after 30 days to accelerate spending, or limit how welfare benefits are spent, allowing only specific merchants or categories of goods. This is not theoretical. Such features are being tested, and while they may be sold as efficiency measures, they also constitute unprecedented control over how people use their money. When such systems are tied to digital identity frameworks, the control deepens. It becomes possible to implement sanctions not just against nations, but against persons in real time. A protester, a dissident, a journalist, all could find their digital wall. It's frozen at the push of a button. There is no due process in code. There is no court of appeal in an algorithm. We must also recognize that CBDCs are emerging in a fragmented geopolitical context. Competing blocs are forming, some led by liberal democracies, others by authoritarian states, each developing their own digital currencies with rules, protocols, and values embedded in their design. Interoperability is not guaranteed. Trust is in short supply, and in such a world, financial fragmentation becomes a political inevitability. Trade routes are redrawn, capital flows are redirected, alliances are tested. Those who fail to adapt risk exclusion. The weaponization of financial tools creates a perverse incentive to decouple, to disengage, to build parallel systems of finance that reflect not universal norms, but regional power structures. Ironically, the very instruments that were supposed to make globalization more fluid and equitable are now accelerating its unraveling. As more states and institutions seek refuge from the extraterritorial reach of sanctions, they also move further away from shared frameworks of cooperation and transparency, but the most insidious effect is the normalization of control. The more society becomes accustomed to programmable money, to restricted access, to economic penalties for ideological nonconformity, the more we internalize the logic of compliance. Autonomy becomes an illusion. Freedom, conditional, and all of it enforced without violence, without spectacle, just quiet restrictions on what one can buy, where one can invest, and how one's wealth may or may not move. We are entering a phase where the boundary between policy and punishment is blurred, where money does not merely represent value, but encodes intent, where access to financial systems is not a right, but a privilege granted in exchange for political alignment. This is not the free market. It is not even managed capitalism. It is a new hybrid, a world where the tools of finance are sharpened into instruments of statecraft, and where sovereignty itself can be bought, sold, or sanctioned into silence. Power, when consolidated, tends to conceal its motives behind grand narratives. It promises order, stability, and efficiency. But beneath these promises lies a core truth that history has taught us repeatedly: centralization of authority, whether in political institutions or financial systems, inevitably breeds opacity, exclusion, and resistance. Today, that resistance has taken a new shape, a decentralized architecture that challenges the very foundation of centralized governance. And as these two forces confront one another, a silent war is being waged not on battlefields, but across code, networks, regulations, and ideology. At the heart of this conflict lies a fundamental disagreement about who should control value, information, and identity. Centralized systems, from governments to central banks to multinational platforms, assert that they alone can guarantee the integrity of the social and economic order. They argue that oversight is essential, that rules must be imposed to protect against abuse, fraud, and instability, but these systems also place extraordinary trust in a narrow set of actors, and trust, once monopolized, becomes a lever for control. Decentralization emerged not as an abstract theory, but as a direct response to this overreach. It is no accident that the rise of cryptocurrencies followed the financial crisis of 2008, a crisis born from the failure of centralized institutions to manage risk, act ethically, or face consequences. Blockchain technology, with its distributed ledgers and consensus mechanisms, offered something radical: the ability to transact without intermediaries, to verify without authorities, and to own without permission. This model, while imperfect and still maturing, represents a profound threat to the status quo, not because it is criminal or destabilizing, though it is often portrayed as such, but because it undermines the centralized power structures that have long governed financial life. In a decentralized network, no single entity can dictate the terms of participation. No central authority can freeze your assets, reverse your transactions, or block your access. It is not anarchy, as critics often claim. It is an architecture designed to distribute trust rather than concentrate it, And this distribution is precisely what has triggered alarm among those who benefit from centralization. Regulatory frameworks are being rewritten with breathtaking speed. New definitions of compliance are emerging, ones that render decentralized platforms and protocols legally precarious. The very act of offering financial autonomy is being recast as a form of subversion. Innovators are forced to choose between exile or assimilation. The message is clear: decentralize if you must, but not in a way that threatens the gatekeepers. Yet, centralization is not merely defending itself, it is adapting. Central banks are now issuing digital currencies, designed not to empower users, but to retain control under a digital veneer. Payment systems are being modernized, but within closed networks, governed by familiar institutions. Identity systems are being digitized not for privacy, but for surveillance. The tools may evolve, but the architecture remains hierarchical. What makes this struggle particularly insidious is its subtlety. Most people do not see the battle. They see faster apps, more convenient banking, smoother user experiences. But underneath the surface, the values embedded in these systems are being encoded in the infrastructure itself. Code becomes law, defaults become doctrine, and choice becomes illusion. The war between decentralization and centralization is not simply about technology. It is about competing visions of the future. One in which power is distributed, transparent, and accountable. The other in which power is concentrated, concealed, and self-reinforcing. In one, individuals are nodes in a network of mutual verification. In the other, they are endpoints in a command structure defined by obedience. This conflict is not binary, nor will it be one overnight. There are legitimate concerns about decentralized systems, their scalability, their governance, their vulnerability to manipulation by those who exploit their openness. But these flaws do not justify erasure. They demand refinement. The answer to flawed decentralization is not tighter centralization, but better decentralization, more resilient, more inclusive, more intelligible. The stakes extend beyond finance. At issue is whether the future will be one in which individuals can transact, communicate, and organize freely, or whether every action must pass through a filter of institutional approval. Whether technology will liberate us from gatekeepers or simply replace old ones with new, more opaque ones, if history is any guide, centralization will not yield without resistance, but neither will the decentralized ethos vanish quietly. It is embedded in the protocols, communities, and ideals of a generation that has seen the cost of unchecked authority. The coming years will determine whether these ideals can survive, evolve, and prevail. This is not a technical debate. It is a political one. And as with all political struggles, it will be decided not only by those in power, but by those willing to imagine and build a different kind of world. We are told that we are free, free to buy what we want, to move money where we choose, to participate in a global economy designed around our preferences and decisions. This, we are assured, is the triumph of the market, a decentralized system where individual choice drives collective outcomes. But if we examine closely, this so-called freedom in spending is a carefully engineered illusion. It is not choice, but choreography, not autonomy, but constraint, disguised by the appearance of abundance. Start with the platforms where most spending now takes place. The digital marketplace, which was once celebrated for its democratizing potential, has become a tightly curated environment where visibility is purchased and behavior is predicted. Algorithms determine what products are seen when they are offered and how they are priced, not based on open competition, but on profiling, segmentation, and manipulation. The consumer is no longer sovereign. They are the subject of continuous surveillance, their decisions nudged and their options filtered through the economic interests of those who control the infrastructure. There is nothing neutral about this architecture. What you are shown, what you are encouraged to buy, is based on a set of commercial and sometimes political incentives you are not privy to. Your attention is auctioned, your habits are monetized, and your preferences are not merely observed, they are shaped. It is a feedback loop where freedom becomes indistinguishable from conditioning. Even the most basic transaction is no longer private. Every payment, whether made with a card, a phone, or a digital wall, it is a data point. That data flows not only to merchants, but to banks, advertising firms, data brokers, and increasingly government agencies. Spending has become a form of disclosure, where to participate in the economy is to be continuously exposed. The paradox is stark. You must give up information in order to transact, and in doing so, you relinquish control over how that information is used against you, and this is not a passive process. It is active, strategic, and expanding. Financial institutions now employ machine learning to assess not just creditworthiness, but risk tolerance, ideological alignment, and behavioral predictability. Payment processors monitor transactions for patterns that may trigger alerts, deplatforming, or account suspension. In some jurisdictions, spending behavior has been tied to social trust scores, where financial freedom is explicitly linked to political obedience. This is the new face of control, invisible, automated, and algorithmic. There are no walls, no handcuffs, no police, only quiet limits on where you can send money, what you are allowed to support, or how you are permitted to express dissent. A donation to the wrong cause, a subscription to a controversial platform, or even a purchase deemed suspicious by a risk model can lead to restrictions without explanation, recourse, or accountability. And while the justification is always the same to protect the system from fraud, extremism, or abuse, the effect is the steady narrowing of permissible behavior. Over time, individuals internalize the constraints. They stop trying to spend in ways that might draw scrutiny. They self-censor, they conform. This is not economic freedom. It is economic discipline, enforced not by law, but by code. Meanwhile, the illusion is maintained by spectacle. Endless choices, infinite products, one-click convenience, but this variety masks the fact that true options are diminishing. Independent sellers are pushed out, local economies are hollowed, monopolistic platforms set the terms of participation. What looks like freedom is, in truth, a highly conditioned experience, a performance of liberty curated for consumption. Digital currencies and fintech innovations, far from decentralizing power, often reinforce this illusion. While they offer new interfaces and experiences, many still operate within the same frameworks of surveillance and control. Some go further, enabling real-time transaction tracking, programmable money, and spending restrictions embedded at the level of the currency itself. This represents not progress, but the codification of conditional freedom. To be truly free in one's spending is not merely to choose among products, It is to participate in a system where the architecture of choice is transparent, accountable, and equitable, where access is not contingent on compliance, where dissent does not carry financial penalties, and where the individual's economic agency is respected rather than harvested. But this vision remains distant. What we have instead is a digital economy where the tools of freedom are increasingly indistinguishable from the tools of control. We are free to spend, but only within the boundaries set for us. We are free to choose, but only from options that have been filtered, priced, and shaped by forces we do not see. The challenge is not just to recognize the illusion, but to confront it. Because as long as we mistake conditioned consumption for autonomy, we will remain participants in a system that rewards conformity, punishes independence, and calls it freedom. The tools of financial freedom, currency, credit, digital payment have been repurposed. They no longer serve only as instruments of exchange, they now function as instruments of control. What you can buy, where you can move your money, even whether you can access your own assets, these decisions are increasingly outsourced to automated systems and unaccountable intermediaries. And yet, the illusion remains intact, because control today does not come dressed in tyranny, it comes draped in convenience. The question, then, is not whether your cash is being weaponized. It is whether you are willing to wake up to that reality and decide whether to reclaim what has already begun slipping from your hands. The future of economic freedom does not belong to those who comply. It belongs to those who question and act before permission becomes the price of participation.